Welcome to Echo of Crime YouTube channel. It began with a routine audit, the kind of paperwork check that usually ends in silence. In March 2016, a data analyst at the California Department of Health noticed something odd. Two women had filed medical insurance claims under the same Social Security number. Both lived in different counties. Both listed different birthdays. Yet somehow, both had matching employment histories. At first, it looked like a clerical glitch, a recycled number, maybe a data entry error. But as the analyst cross-referenced the names, she noticed something stranger. The same number appeared again, then again. By the end of the afternoon, the system had pulled 14 active identities, all connected to one fingerprint pattern. The name most recently used was Elaine Parker, a registered nurse in San Jose. She lived in a modest apartment, drove a used Toyota, and paid her bills on time. Nothing about her life seemed out of place. But when investigators traced her records backward, her life began to split like a broken mirror. Elaine Parker, Diane Moore, Lisa Hanley, Catherine Wells, Jane Lewis, each with a different address, job, and history. It was as if she'd lived a dozen lives in the same lifetime. By the time the department referred the case to federal investigators, the evidence file was already hundreds of pages long. Each alias had a valid tax record, real phone number, and social security file. One of them had even filed as a foster parent in Oregon. There were no flags for criminal activity, no debts, no missing persons reports. Whoever she wasn't hiding from law enforcement. She was blending in perfectly. When Special Agent Ruth Calder from the Department of Justice's Fraud Division took over, she thought it would be an open and shut case, maybe a family using shared identities or a stolen data ring. But the deeper she went, the less sense it made. The handwriting on several applications was nearly identical. The photographs, though aged and cropped differently, all showed the same woman, her expression calm and familiar. It wasn't identity theft in the usual sense. It was identity multiplication. The first clue came from a property record in Eugene, Oregon, where Elisa Hanley had purchased a small house in 2007. When investigators pulled the archived photo from the DMV, they froze. It was the same woman as Elaine Parker, only a decade younger and wearing glasses. The house had been sold 3 years later to another woman named Catherine Wells, who lived there briefly before moving to California. But here's the twist. Catherine Wells's photo matched Elaine's again. Agents began retracing her financial transactions. Dozens of small bank accounts, all legally registered. None of them large enough to attract attention. She never stole millions. She never bought luxury items. Her withdrawals were consistent, careful, and quiet. That's when the question changed. They stopped asking what she was doing and started asking why. On paper, Elaine Parker was an ordinary woman. Mid-40s, former nurse, no criminal history. But interviews painted a more complicated picture. Neighbors remembered her as quiet and kind, but slightly distant. She smiled, but she never said much, one recalled. Sometimes I'd see her talking on the phone, but I never knew who she was talking to. She'd always say she worked nights. When agents ran a background check on her earliest known identity, Diane Moore, they found no record of her birth. The trail stopped abruptly in 1999. The same year, an unidentified woman checked into a Nevada women's shelter under a false name. Client states she is fleeing a dangerous partner. No family contact. Requests anonymity. That was nearly 20 years before her arrest. If it was Elaine, and evidence strongly suggested it was, then this story didn't begin with greed. It began with fear. As agents pieced together her aliases, a pattern emerged. Each new identity began after a period of financial stress, relocation, or job loss. She'd move, change her name, reset her documents, and start over. Over and over again. It wasn't until 2003 that she began to exploit the system. Using small business grants, she filed multiple tax IDs, each tied to one of her names. Over the years, she used these aliases to secure loans, apply for jobs, and even enroll in classes. Her life was a network of half-truths, each supporting the next, like dominoes arranged in a perfect circle. The real genius wasn't in her ability to forge documents. It was in her restraint. She never drew too much attention, never overreached. Her crimes were small, quiet, and sustained for almost 2 decades before anyone noticed. By late 2017, a coordinated task force was in place. Federal investigators cross-checked her 14 names against national databases, finally isolating her through her fingerprint from an old nursing license renewal form. They found her living in San Jose alone, still using her most recent identity as Elaine Parker. When they knocked on her door, she answered calmly, wearing a pale blue cardigan and holding a mug of tea. She didn't resist. She didn't deny it. Her first words to the agents were quiet, almost rehearsed. "I wondered when you'd find me." Inside her apartment, they found boxes of documents, not money, not fake IDs, but old photos, journals, and handwritten letters signed under different names. Each name had a story, each identity, a beginning and an end. It was the life of a woman who had rewritten herself 14 times and finally ran out of pages. When investigators sat down with the evidence they'd collected from Elaine Parker's apartment, it didn't look like the spoils of a con artist. There were no luxury handbags, no hidden cash, no fake passports. Instead, they found something stranger, a life meticulously built out of paperwork. Stacks of tax forms filled her small kitchen table. Driver's licenses, certificates, resumes, each one bearing a new name but the same face. Every identity had its own story, its own purpose. Some lasted months, others lasted years. All of them had something in common. They existed just long enough to keep her one step ahead of reality. Federal analysts began to build what they called the identity web. Each alias was pinned on a digital board, connected by strings of overlapping dates, locations, and phone numbers. Diane Moore, 1999 to 2002, the first known identity, worked as a home caregiver in Nevada, disappeared after her employer switched payroll systems. Lisa Hanley, 2003 to 2007 Oregon real estate agent, filed taxes, owned property, disappeared after a housing crash. Catherine Wells, 2007 to 2010 substitute teacher in Washington, lived in a rented duplex, terminated after failing a background recheck. Rachel Smith, Jane Lewis, Patricia Owens, and 8 others, each more convincing than the last. Every time one life closed, another began. Each name allowed her to blend in, to start fresh, to erase the woman she used to be. For investigators, it felt less like chasing a criminal and more like trying to catch a ghost. What made Elaine's operation extraordinary wasn't her technical skill. It was her patience. She didn't hack databases or forge digital records. She exploited what already existed, bureaucratic gaps. When moving between states, she'd use the identities of people who had died decades earlier, children whose birth certificates were never cross-referenced against death records. She'd request certified copies, slightly alter birth years, and reissue Social Security applications under new addresses. The process was slow, manual, and nearly invisible. Every name gave her new credit history, new health records, and new opportunities. She would never stay long in one job or one city, 3 to 5 years, then disappear quietly before anyone noticed the inconsistencies. To most people, she wasn't a suspect. She was just the new woman in town, polite, quiet, professional, and always paying her bills on time. During the early interrogations, investigators noticed that Elaine never referred to herself in the first person when discussing her aliases. She spoke about them like characters in a book. Catherine liked teaching, she once said softly. Lisa was better with people than I ever was. To Agent Calder, the lead investigator, this was the most disturbing part. Elaine hadn't just created fake identities. She'd split herself into fragments over 20 years. Each one had been born out of necessity, a failed marriage, a new state, a lost job, or the fear of being recognized. But somewhere along the line, she stopped switching names to escape danger and started doing it because she no longer remembered who she really was. Her journals reflected that shift. On the first page of one notebook, she wrote, "If I don't exist in one place, maybe I can exist everywhere." The handwriting changed slightly between entries, almost as if each alias had its own signature. The facade started to crack in 2015 when one of her aliases, Rachel Smith, applied for a small business loan in Arizona using a social security number that was also registered in California. The system flagged the mismatch, but never followed up. It wasn't until the next year that the same alias filed a tax return under another name, triggering the initial alert that would expose her entire operation. By then, Elaine was managing at least 6 active lives at once. She was receiving mail for different names at multiple post office boxes across 3 states. She paid bills using prepaid cards, moved money in small increments, and even managed to keep her credit score consistent across her identities. To her, it wasn't fraud. It was survival disguised as routine. Each name protected her from the collapse of the last. She once told investigators, "If I stopped changing, everything would catch up to me." No one was sure if she meant the law or her past. While most identity criminals are caught through greed, Elaine's pattern was different. Her fraud was slow and methodical. Over 20 years, she accumulated an estimated $2.4 million, spread across microloans, wages, and benefits, none of which exceeded legal reporting thresholds. She didn't buy cars or property. She rented everything: homes, vehicles, even storage lockers. Investigators found over 50 rental agreements signed under different names, most within driving distance of each other. In one of those lockers, they found something strange: a small box containing old family photos, all torn in half, faces missing. On the back of one was written, "Don't forget her." By late 2017, Elaine's carefully constructed lives began to unravel faster than she could rebuild them. Background check systems had become more sophisticated. States had begun cross-verifying birth records digitally, something they hadn't done when she first started. Her most recent identity, Elaine Parker, was now linked to several outdated addresses. When she applied to renew her nursing license that year, her fingerprints triggered an automatic match to Catherine Wells, a name that hadn't existed in over a decade. Within 48 hours, a federal task force had her under full surveillance. Agents watched her go about her quiet life, buying groceries, walking home from the bus stop, sitting alone at a cafe, completely unaware that every alias she'd ever used was collapsing around her. When agents finally approached her at home, she didn't run. She simply opened the door and asked, "Which name do you want?" It wasn't sarcasm. It was exhaustion. For years, she had lived behind masks, so carefully built that removing them no longer felt possible. When she was taken in, she didn't ask for a lawyer. She asked for her notebooks, the only things, she said, that still kept her lives in order. The arrest didn't make headlines at first. In a small press release buried deep within a federal docket, the Department of Justice simply stated, "A 47-year-old woman has been charged with multiple counts of identity fraud, false documentation, and mail fraud following a multi-state investigation." No photo, no fanfare, no mention of the name, because at that point, even the authorities weren't entirely sure which one to use. But inside the sterile interview room of a San Jose field office, the woman known most recently as Elaine Parker sat quietly, hands folded, eyes fixed on the table. After 20 years of deception, there was no panic, no denial, only a strange sense of relief. "It's exhausting," she told investigators. "Waking up every day and remembering who you're supposed to be." The interrogation. The lead investigator, Agent Ruth Calder, began the questioning softly. She wanted to understand how one person had managed to deceive multiple state systems without ever leaving a digital footprint of suspicion. For hours, Elaine recounted her life, or rather, lives. She spoke of the first name she'd ever used after fleeing Nevada, Diane Moore, the caregiver who simply wanted to disappear. Then came Lisa Hanley, Catherine Wells, and the string of names that followed, each one crafted to survive a new phase of fear, uncertainty, or guilt. Calder pressed gently. "Why 14?" Elaine shrugged. "I stopped counting." She explained how each identity became easier to create than to destroy. Once she became someone new, the old version of her would fade, like a forgotten password. Sometimes she didn't even plan the switch. A lost job, an expired lease, or a chance encounter was all it took for her to start over again. What fascinated investigators most was her lack of financial ambition. She wasn't building wealth, she was building distance. When the case reached federal court later that year, the media finally caught wind of it. Headlines called her the woman of 14 faces, the real-life chameleon, and the ghost of the system. Reporters painted her as a master manipulator, but those who met her in person described something else entirely: a calm, polite woman with tired eyes. Her public defender said she was the most remorseful client I've ever met. In court, the prosecution laid out the evidence: 14 names, 9 states, 27 years of records. They showed the digital board of identities, each one a thread in her web. Elaine watched quietly, her expression unreadable. When asked if she had anything to say, she stood, straightened her gray sweater, and said only, "I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just didn't want to be found." It was a statement that silenced the courtroom. After 3 days of testimony, the court delivered its judgment. Elaine Parker, or whatever her true name once was found guilty on multiple counts of identity fraud, mail fraud, and false representation. The sentence: 8 years in federal prison, followed by supervised release and mandatory psychological evaluation. It was far less than the prosecution had demanded, but even the judge admitted that the case wasn't one of greed or malice. It was a story of a woman who had gotten lost in the systems meant to track her. Before being led away, she looked at the judge and said softly, "You can take my name. I've lived without one before. Life behind the walls." Prison was the first time in 20 years that Elaine had only one name. She spent most of her days in the library, volunteering to organize case files and helping other inmates with paperwork. A quiet irony that didn't go unnoticed. In therapy, she began writing again, small journal entries in the third person. She'd write, "Elaine woke up early today. Catherine misses Oregon. Diane still dreams of the desert." Her counselor said it was her way of reconciling her fractured identities, turning them into memories instead of masks. Over time, she stopped writing in plural. The entries grew shorter, simpler. "I am here. I exist. I am learning who I was." While she served her sentence, the systems she once exploited were upgraded. State databases integrated cross-verification tools. Birth certificates, death records, and social security numbers were synchronized nationwide, closing the loopholes she had slipped through for decades. Ironically, her case was studied in cybersecurity and forensic identity programs, used as a training model for how paper-based systems could be manipulated by persistence rather than hacking. To the public, she became a cautionary tale, not a villain, but a symptom of how fragile identity could be before the digital age caught up. When she was released in 2026, there were no reporters waiting. She walked out quietly with a small duffel bag, a new name issued by the state, and a record that would follow her for life. The woman who had lived under 14 names was now legally given her 15th, though she'd later say it was the only one that ever truly belonged to her. She moved to a halfway home in Northern California and worked as a clerk in a community records office, the very kind she once slipped through. When asked once by a journalist how she felt about her story being turned into documentaries and case studies, she replied, "People think I fooled the system. But the truth is, the system never really knew me. And maybe for a while, I didn't either."